Zion Whitaker took his time. He walked the familiar route to school, a 15-minute trek past cracked sidewalks and old storefronts with peeling paint. The morning was as overcast as ever, the sun just barely breaking through the gray clouds. His backpack slung over one shoulder, feeling heavier than usual, maybe because of the upcoming debate tournament, or the history test he'd been studying for all night. Either way, it was just another day. Or so he thought. A siren tore through the quiet air, pulling Zion from his thoughts. Up ahead, red and blue flashing lights reflected in the glass windows of the corner hardware store. He slowed, adjusting his hoodie as he glanced at the commotion. A window was broken, yellow police tape was up, an officer was conferring with the store owner. Zion sighed, preparing to move on. Hands up. The command came before Zion could process what was happening. In a flash, a cop was charging toward him, his hand on the butt of his gun. Officer Roy Kincaid. The name was familiar. The neighborhood knew him not for his protection but for his unwarranted harassment. What's going on? Zion tried to keep his voice even, though his heart was pounding in his chest. But his question hung in the air, unanswered. We got him. Kincaid yelled into his radio, and without hesitation, he yanked Zion's arm behind his back. His wrists were twisted painfully, the iron cuffs digging into his flesh. Wait. I didn't do anything. Zion gasped, but his voice was ignored. His eyes scanned the area, passers-by stood watching, some shaking their heads, some looking away. No one spoke. Don't play dumb. Kincaid muttered, shooting Zion a contemptuous look. The security cameras caught you near the store when it was vandalized. You fit the description perfectly. Description? Zion blinked. How could that be? He had never been in that store. Never done anything wrong. But the truth didn't matter when he was chained to a crime he didn't commit. The courtroom was cold and solemn. Zion sat there, his eyes sharper than the accusations that surrounded him. He was no longer a scared kid. He had the truth in his hands, and this time, he wasn't going to be crushed. When the judge asked if he had anything to say, Zion took a deep breath and stood up. And in that moment, the entire courtroom froze. Because he didn't just speak. He turned the case upside down. Zion walked down the sidewalk, head bowed, hands shoved deep into the pockets of his dark hoodie. He hadn't even gotten close to the store. And yet. What did he do? He didn't even get close to the store, sir. I didn't do anything, Kincaid scoffed, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Zion's sneakers scuffed on the rough pavement as he tried to back away, but the wail of sirens numbed all thought. A small crowd gathered across the street, some slowing down, others taking out their phones to record. But no one stepped forward. No one said anything. Zion's heart was pounding. It had all happened so fast. The cop had grabbed his arm, shoved him toward the patrol car. He wanted to scream, to say they were wrong, that he hadn't even done anything. But the words wouldn't come out of his throat. This couldn't be happening. It couldn't be. But as the patrol car door slammed shut behind him, as the cold metal clicked, the truth began to sink in. His life would never be the same again. Inside the car, the air was suffocating. The smell of sweat, old leather, the distinct smell of the people who had sat here before him. Zion sat rigid, his wrists aching from the tight handcuffs. Every little movement made the metal dig deeper into his flesh. He wanted to scream, to want them to check the cameras, to want them to actually see the footage. But he knew better than anyone, no one cared about the truth of a kid like him. The trip to the police station was short but felt like a lifetime. The cop in front of him, someone he didn't recognize, barely said anything as they pulled up. No explanation. No concern. When they dragged him out of the car, his backpack was left behind. The fluorescent lights on the ceiling hummed, reflecting off the emotionless white tile floor. Cold. Not ordinary cold, but the kind that penetrated to the bones, into the chest. First they took his name. Then they took his fingerprints. Then his shoelaces. Like he was a real criminal, someone who had given up on his life. A tired-eyed cop pushed him into a metal chair. "Your mother has been called." The voice was eerily calm. Like this was just routine. Just another child being processed. Zion swallowed. A lump formed in his throat. His mother. Lorraine Whitaker. A single mother, working 2 jobs. The strongest woman he had ever known. The only person he couldn't bear to worry about. Minutes stretched into hours. Then another. And finally. The heavy door swung open. Lorraine stormed in. Her eyes locked on Zion. Lorraine stood beside her son, her eyes blazing like torches in the cramped interrogation room. Zion sat there, back straight, hands on the table, trying to keep his composure, but she could see his fists clenched. An officer leaned over him, his eyes searching for signs of harm, not hiding his suspicion. "We need to search him for signs of harm," the officer said, his voice even but authoritative. Lorraine turned to him, her voice clear but sharp as fire. "Where's his lawyer? What is he even charged with?" Sergeant Kincaid entered the room, his arms folded across his chest. His badge glinted in the light, a cold reminder of the power he represented. "We have surveillance." He was near the crime scene. A store was broken into and some tools were stolen. He fits the suspect's description. Lorraine's nostrils flared. "And what's that description?" "Sneakers. Dark hoodie." Zion clenched her jaw, her eyes glancing at her mother. Her hands clenched into fists at her sides, taking deep breaths to steady herself. "My son is walking to school," she said, each word a knife. Kincaid shrugged. "That's what you said." The rage in Lorraine's eyes could have burned down the walls around her. But she knew anger wouldn't free Zion. The door opened. A man in a wrinkled suit walked in, flipping through a folder in his hands as if he were seeing the case for the first time. He didn't even look at Zion. "They're offering a plea deal," he said, his voice weary. Lorraine's head whipped toward him. "What?" The lawyer exhaled, his eyes blank. "If he pleads guilty, he can avoid a trial. Community service. Probation. That's the best option." Zion felt his stomach sink like a rock falling into a chasm. The best option was to plead guilty to something he didn't do. "No," his mother's voice was as hard as steel. "We're not signing anything." The lawyer sighed as if he'd heard it 1,000 times before. "I understand, Miss Whitaker, but these cases don't usually go well." This is his word against the police. A trial could mean. "No," Lorraine cut in. Zion looked at his mother, his chest heaving with a mix of gratitude and anxiety. He knew she would fight to the end, but what scared him wasn't just the system that was stacked against him. It was the way everyone in this room had decided his fate without knowing the truth. But he wouldn't let them decide his future. Zion barely slept that night. Zion lay on his bed, eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. Everything played over and over in his head like an old police movie. The click of cold handcuffs tightening around his wrists. Kincaid's half-smile, the disdain in his eyes as he spoke to Zion's mother, a public defender. Smooth talk urging a plea bargain, as if it were the only way out. Zion wasn't a lawyer. He was just a kid. But even he knew something was wrong. Dawn was breaking, and his decision was made. If no one would fight for him, he would fight for himself. At school, he skipped lunch and headed straight for the library. The legal section wasn't large, mostly old textbooks and outdated reference materials, but it was all he had. He scanned the spines until his eyes landed on a thick volume, Criminal Procedure. Zion flipped through the pages, his eyes racing over the words, trying to grasp onto anything that might help him make sense of his situation. Burden of proof, the prosecutor must prove his guilt, not the other way around. Chain of evidence: if the police don't handle the process properly, evidence can be thrown out. Corroborative evidence: the police's word carries weight, but inconsistencies can undermine their testimony. The more he read, the clearer it became. They had nothing on him. No fingerprints. No stolen goods. Just a blurry video of a guy in a hoodie. Then he paused. A glimmer of hope flashed through his mind. How tall was the suspect? Zion wasn't exactly tall for his age. 5 feet 4 inches on a good day. What if the person in the video was taller? What if he could prove it wasn't him? He pulled down another book, Techniques of Cross-Examination, and began to skim through it, his hands shaking with excitement. What's going on? Zion was startled. Standing before him was Mr. Langford, the salt-and-pepper-haired librarian with the thick glasses. He looked over the pile of books with a sharp gaze. Just doing some research, Zion replied, trying to keep his composure. Langford was silent for a long moment, then slowly pulled up a chair and sat down across from him. You're in trouble, aren't you? Zion hesitated. He could have lied, said it was homework. But something in the old man's eyes made him sigh. Yes. Langford nodded slightly, as if he had seen this happen too many times. Then he leaned forward, his voice low and firm. Well, you better know what you're doing. Zion sat in the courtroom, the scent of old wood and coffee filling his nostrils. It was a far cry from the quiet of the library last night, where he had prepared for this moment. His heart was pounding, not with fear but with tension. This was no longer a matter of right or wrong. This was a fight. Beside him, the public defender, a middle-aged man with gray hair and a weary expression, flipped through his notes. No encouraging glance, no reassuring word. Zion gritted his teeth. If he was going to fight for the truth, he might as well do it himself. Across the room, Sergeant Roy Kincaid sat upright in his uniform, his gaze sharp. He wasn't nervous. He didn't doubt. The man believed he had done the right thing. The judge entered, an older man with gray hair and knowing eyes. When the gavel came down, the room fell into tense silence. The prosecutor stood. A woman in a navy blue suit, her every step confident, her every word sharp as a knife. Your Honor, this case is not complicated. She turned to the jury. The defendant, Zion Carter, was seen near the scene of the crime. He matches the description given by witnesses and the surveillance footage. Zion clenched his fists. The familiar words rang in his head like a foregone conclusion. Probable cause. Those 2 words had taken away his freedom. Those 2 words could ruin his life. The prosecutor continued, each word carrying weight. Sergeant Kincaid, an officer with over 20 years of experience, arrested the defendant on the basis of legitimate evidence. We believe that this case speaks for itself. Zion looked at the jury. A few nodded along with the prosecutor. He could see it in their eyes, some of them believed him guilty. His throat was dry. No, he couldn't let them decide his fate based on empty accusations. He couldn't just hope for justice anymore. He had to fight for it. As the prosecutor returned to his seat, his defense attorney stood. Zion held his breath, waiting. This was the moment. But then, he simply adjusted his tie, cleared his throat, and said, Your Honor, my client denies all charges. And that was it. Zion felt a simmering anger rising. This wasn't the courtroom he'd imagined, where the truth was honored. This was a battle, and he was left alone in the middle of it. The real battle had only just begun. The store was broken into. Merchandise was taken. No one knew exactly who did it, but a witness said they saw a person in a hoodie and sneakers loitering nearby at the time of the incident. It all made sense. The prosecutor presented the case smoothly, without a single flaw. But Zion's fingers were clearly clenched on the cold wooden table. He couldn't believe it. Then the defense attorney stood up, adjusted his tie, cleared his throat. My client maintains his innocence. We intend to prove that the evidence is not compelling enough to convict him. It was the best he could say. Zion closed his eyes, just for a split second, to contain his frustration. He had known this. He wasn't going to be thrown under the bus that easily. Mr. Whitaker, the judge said, pulling Zion from his thoughts. I understand you want to make your case. He took a deep breath. In the back row, his mother was watching with bated breath. Zion stood. The courtroom fell silent. He took a step forward, facing the jury. This was his only chance. Let's talk about the evidence, or lack thereof, he said, his voice calm but commanding. A murmur ran through the room. Zion turned to the prosecutor's desk. Where's the security footage? The prosecutor leaned forward, then nodded. We're ready to play it. The screen turned on. The video showed a blurry image, a figure in a hoodie, moving quickly through the shattered window. His face was completely obscured. Zion crossed his arms. That was it. That's him, the prosecutor announced, his voice full of certainty. Zion shook his head. No. Not me. Silence. He turned to the judge. Sir, may I ask a question? The judge nodded. Zion looked directly at Sergeant Kincaid. Officer, how tall am I? Kincaid blinked, clearly surprised by the question. Zion pointed at the screen, his eyes as sharp as knives. Now, tell me why. The courtroom held its breath. The store's security camera log showed a blurry, but clear image. The suspect is 5 feet 9 inches. A pause. Not just a normal silence, but a heavy, heavy pause. The prosecutor clenched his jaw, his eyes flicking to Kincaid. The officer frowned, his fingers unconsciously tightening on the wooden chair. Zion's pulse was pounding, but he didn't let it show. This was just the beginning. The room filled with a special kind of silence, not a meaningless emptiness, but a weighty silence, as if everyone were waiting for an explosion. And then it came. Zion stood, his breathing slow, his gaze unwavering. The suspect in the video is 5 feet 9 inches. He let the words hang in the air, letting everyone deduce the obvious. I'm 5 feet 4 inches. A ripple of commotion rose in the room. The judge leaned toward the prosecutor, his voice calm but heavy. Do you have any explanation for this discrepancy? The prosecutor's lips pressed together, her eyes flashing with annoyance. The footage quality was poor. It would have been difficult to get an accurate measurement. Zion shook his head slightly, his voice unwavering. No, not according to the store's security system. He turned to the jury, his expression calm but his words piercing the cracks of the case. Most modern security cameras have a height scale at the entrance. They're designed to accurately measure the height of anyone who walks through. The footage they're showing you. That height marker is right there. And the suspect walked past it. The jury looked at each other, realization dawning in their eyes. Kincaid shifted in his chair. The cop knew. He had to know. The prosecutor sighed, but tried to stay on the offensive. Even if the height wasn't right, the suspect's hoodie and sneakers matched. That still puts you in the scene. Zion didn't flinch. He'd been expecting this. With all due respect, that's not how evidence works. He turned back to Kincaid, his voice cutting through the air like a knife. Officer Kincaid, did you check my shoes when you arrested me? The air seemed frozen. Kincaid's fingers tapped the armrest of his chair, an unconscious action. Of course. Zion nodded, as if he already knew the answer. And are these the shoes the suspect was wearing? Kincaid hesitated. Just for a second. But even that second, the entire courtroom saw. The prosecutor cleared his throat, trying to regain control. We don't have to prove every detail. Yes. Zion cut in, his voice thunderous in the silence. And everything fell apart. Zion was not a lawyer, but he knew the law. He knew that to convict a person, the evidence had to be beyond a reasonable doubt. And right now, doubt hung over this case. The judge turned to the prosecutor, his voice stern. Do you have any direct evidence? Any evidence that clearly links the defendant to the crime? The prosecutor hesitated. The tension in the courtroom grew. Finally, he said. The officer believes. The officer believes. Zion interrupted, his voice sharp but unwavering. His eyes locked on Sergeant Kincaid. That's not evidence. That's conjecture. And conjecture can destroy a man's life. The room was silent. No one dared to breathe. Then Zion took a deep breath and stepped forward, his eyes never leaving the judge. Your Honor, may I present something to the court? The judge nodded, his eyes searching. Zion slowly pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket. He unfolded it, then walked to the witness stand and placed it on the table. This is a disciplinary report for Sergeant Kincaid. The prosecution suddenly tensed. The prosecutor frowned, and the judge raised his eyes slightly, looking curious. And where did you get this document? Zion kept his tone calm, unflinching. It's public record, Your Honor. The room fell silent as the judge turned the pages. The atmosphere gradually changed. The jury's eyes were fixed on him. When the judge looked up, his voice rang out clearly. Sergeant Kincaid, is it true that you have received multiple complaints of false arrest? The entire courtroom could see Kincaid's jaw tighten, his fingers twitching on the table. That's irrelevant, Kincaid growled. Zion turned to the jury, his eyes blazing with the fire of truth. Is it irrelevant? I think it's important. Important because the cop who's charging me has been caught doing this before. And if he has, who's to say he won't do it again? The prosecutor seemed about to protest, but before he could open his mouth, the judge raised his hand. The mood in the courtroom changed dramatically. Where the jury had previously viewed Zion as a suspect, they now viewed him as an innocent young man caught in an unjust system. Sergeant Kincaid, who had been so defiant, tensed. He swallowed, his eyes averted. Zion felt it. Felt it for the first time since this nightmare began, he was winning. But the biggest revelation was still ahead. Zion could see the subtle changes in Kincaid's demeanor. The usual arrogant confidence had eroded, replaced by a poorly concealed tension. The tight grip on his wrist, the way he avoided eye contact, small but unmistakable signs. And then the judge's cool voice rang out. We'll take a moment before the jury returns its verdict. He paused, his eyes scanning the courtroom. And I want to speak to the prosecutor in my office. No one had to say it, never a good sign. Zion sat down, breathing slowly, trying to calm himself. From the back row, his mother reached up to squeeze his shoulder. You did well, she whispered, but Zion couldn't celebrate. It wasn't over yet. 20 minutes later, everyone was back in their seats. The jury had filed out. The executioner spoke. The court orders. The foreman stood, the paper in his hand shaking slightly. Your Honor, we have a verdict. Zion held his breath as the judge nodded. On the charge of theft, the jury finds the defendant Zion Whitaker, not guilty. A wave of relief surged through Zion's chest. Behind him, Lorraine let out a sigh, her hands clasped in silent prayer. But the judge wasn't done. He turned to the prosecutor, his gaze full of authority. After reviewing the evidence and new information presented, I am ordering the district attorney's office to open an internal investigation into Sergeant Kincaid's conduct. The courtroom was stunned. All eyes turned to Kincaid. His face was red, his hands clenched. Your Honor, this is absurd. Kincaid roared, but was immediately cut off. The judge leaned forward, his voice stern and uncompromising. I advise you to be careful what you say, officer. Because this court has seen enough today to wonder if you still deserve that badge. The air in the room seemed to freeze. No one dared to breathe. Zion watched as Kincaid, the man who had once had absolute power over his fate, was now trapped, helpless, just as he had been just days ago. But this time, it wasn't him who was backed into a corner. The judge cleared his throat, picked up the gavel. This case is adjourned. The gavel thumped down. It was over. Zion turned, and before he could react, Lorraine hugged him tightly. She buried her face in his shoulder, her voice choked with pride. You did it. Even as relief flooded over him, Zion felt one thing clearly: this wasn't just about him anymore. If Kincaid had done this to him, how many others had been silenced? How many had been crushed under the system that was supposed to protect them? But Zion wasn't done yet. He wasn't off the field. The sky seemed wider today, the air lighter, but freedom tastes bitter when you fought for it. When he walked out of the courthouse, he was no longer a defendant, he was a free man. But this freedom wasn't given, it was earned through perseverance and blood, sweat, and tears. Reporters crowded the steps, cameras flashing, microphones thrust in front of him. How does it feel to prove your innocence? A voice rang out from the crowd. Zion scanned the people around him, searching for an answer. A warm hand rested on his shoulder, his mother's. A powerful touch, pulling him back to the present. He could have said he was relieved, or angry. That he was exhausted from fighting to be recognized as innocent. Instead, he looked straight into the camera. I shouldn't have to prove my innocence. Silence fell. The pens on the notepad stopped. The weight of the words fell, as heavy as the system that had tried to crush him. Because this wasn't just a case. This was a fight. A fight against a system designed to crush people like him. Lorraine pulled him away from the crowd, leading him toward the car. But before they could get far, a voice called out behind him, "Hey, kid." Zion turned. It was Mr. Langford, the librarian who had believed in him when no one else did. He wasn't alone. Beside him sat a few old friends who had seen him put in this position. Even children. Faces of hope, waiting for him to say something. You did it, Langford said, nodding. You made them listen. Zion swallowed the lump in his throat. Yes, but what about the kids who didn't get a chance? Langford studied him for a moment, then smiled. Perhaps that's your job. Make sure they're heard, too. The words stuck with Zion, piercing him like an unbreakable oath. In the days that followed, the internal investigation into Sergeant Kincaid became public. Other stories spilled out. New names emerged. Children who had been destroyed by a heartless system. Some had been forced to confess, just so the nightmare would end. Others had lost years of their youth. Zion had won his case, but the fight was not over. He wasn't done yet. A week later, he walked into the school library. Beneath his arm was a notebook. Langford looked up from his desk, eyebrows raised. What's this? Zion put the notebook down on the table. A list. What list? He took a deep breath, then said, every law I've read. Every right people need to know. Every trick they use to shut us up. He pushed the notebook forward. I want to help kids like me. I want to make sure this never happens again. Langford looked at him for a long moment, then smiled. Then you should get to work. Zion nodded, determined. Justice doesn't come easy. But when you fight for it, you make it impossible to ignore. And this was just the beginning.